Millionaire CEO calls black waitress idiot, and lost $2.6 billion deal on the spot. The word idiot exploded from Alexander Whitmore's mouth like a bomb, and as the black waitress standing before him lifted her chin with quiet dignity, he had no idea that his $2.6 billion empire was about to crumble in the next 60 seconds. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The word idiot left his lips before Alexander Whitmore could stop it, and in that instant, the black waitress standing before him became the woman who would cost him $2.6 billion and save his soul. But that moment was still 3 hours away as Victoria James pressed her uniform in the cramped employee break room of Le Bernardin, Beverly Hills, her hands steady despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in her bones these days. At 28, she had perfected the art of invisible excellence, serving multi-millionaires who never saw her face, only the precision with which she anticipated their needs. Her phone buzzed against the metal locker. A text from her mother in Atlanta. Rent notice came again. I'm sorry, baby. Victoria closed her eyes, calculating rapidly. Her shift at the restaurant would cover half. The weekend catering gig in Malibu would handle the rest, if she was lucky with tips. Her master's degree in economics from Emory University hung framed in her studio apartment, a beautiful reminder of dreams deferred by reality's harsh mathematics. Victoria, you're on table 12 tonight, called James, the floor manager, poking his head into the break room. High-profile business dinner. The CEO specifically requested our best server. She nodded, straightening her shoulders. Table 12 meant serious money, the kind of clients who could tip more in one evening than most people made in a week. These dinners were performances. She became invisible, efficient, perfect. They never saw Victoria James, magna cum laude, community advocate, daughter who sent half her paycheck home to keep her mother's lights on. They saw the help. What do you think drives someone to excellence even when they're overlooked? Share your thoughts on finding dignity in difficult circumstances. 3,000 miles away, Alexander Whitmore stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan corner office, surveying the city that had bent to his will for 15 years. At 42, he commanded Whitmore Industries with the ruthless efficiency that had built a tech empire worth $8.7 billion. The merger he was flying to Los Angeles to finalize would add another $2.6 billion to that number. His assistant, Jennifer, appeared in the doorway with military precision. Your car to JFK is here, Mr. Whitmore. The Tanaka Industries executives confirmed dinner at Le Bernardin, Beverly Hills. 7:30 sharp. Alexander barely glanced up from his phone, where he was reading the final merger documents. The Tanaka deal would make him the largest tech infrastructure provider on the West Coast. It was the culmination of 2 years of negotiations, the crown jewel of his career. Make sure the restaurant knows this dinner is critical, he said, sliding into his tailored Tom Ford jacket. I don't want any mistakes. These Japanese executives expect perfection. Already handled, sir. They've assigned their top server. Alexander nodded, his mind already 3 steps ahead to the quarterly projections that would follow the merger. He lived in a world of numbers, stock prices, and power lunches where human connection was measured in profit margins and strategic advantage. At 42, he had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered, though he wouldn't realize this for another 6 hours. The drive to JFK passed in a blur of conference calls and emails. Alexander had built his fortune on the belief that efficiency and results mattered more than feelings or relationships. His personal life reflected this philosophy. No wife, no children, no attachments that could complicate business decisions. He prided himself on never letting emotions cloud his judgment. His father had taught him that success meant staying focused on what was important. Profit, power, position. Don't get distracted by people who don't add value to your life, the elder Whitmore had always said. It was advice that had served Alexander well in boardrooms but left him sitting alone in first-class cabins, surrounded by success and utterly empty. As his private jet lifted off from JFK, Alexander reviewed the Tanaka profiles one final time. These executives controlled manufacturing contracts worth billions. They valued precision, respect, and flawless execution. Everything had to be perfect. He had no idea that perfection was about to shatter in the form of a brilliant woman whose worth he was too blind to see. Victoria arrived at Le Bernardin 45 minutes before her shift, as always. She used the time to study the evening's reservations, memorizing dietary restrictions and preferences. Table 12 caught her attention. Alexander Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries, hosting executives from Tanaka Industries. The notes indicated this was a high-stakes business dinner worth billions. She had learned to read her clients like stock reports. Their body language, their priorities, their egos. Rich men like Whitmore usually wanted to be seen as powerful and important. They spoke to her only when necessary, treating service staff as sophisticated furniture. Victoria. James approached with the evening's briefing. Table 12 is make or break for this guy. His assistant called twice to confirm every detail. Don't give him any reason to complain. Never do, she replied simply. As she arranged her service station, Victoria's mind wandered briefly to the economics paper she'd been writing in her spare time, analyzing wealth inequality in major American cities. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would spend tonight serving men who earned more in a day than she made in a year, while her research sat unpublished because she couldn't afford the time to pursue academic conferences or networking events. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her mother. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Victoria smiled despite her exhaustion. Her mother never asked about money directly, never made her feel guilty for the sacrifices. But Victoria knew the electricity bill was overdue, knew her mother was rationing her diabetes medication to make it last longer. "Good day, Mama. Love you." She slipped the phone into her locker and walked onto the restaurant floor, transforming into the perfect server. Gracious, efficient, invisible. In 3 hours, she would serve a man who would change both their lives with a single word. Neither of them was ready for what was coming. The Tanaka executives arrived at Le Bernardin Beverly Hills with the punctuality that had made their Tokyo-based company a global powerhouse. Victoria watched from her service station as 3 impeccably dressed Japanese businessmen were seated at table 12, their movements deliberate and respectful as they surveyed the restaurant's understated elegance. Alexander Whitmore arrived 15 minutes later, his presence immediately commanding attention. Tall, sharp-featured, and wearing confidence like an expensive cologne, he moved through the restaurant as if he owned it. Which, Victoria thought wryly, he probably could. She approached the table with practiced grace, water pitcher in hand and mental notes ready. The Tanaka executives, Mr. Tanaka, Mr. Yamamoto, and Ms. Sato, had requested still water, no ice. Alexander had no special requests on file, which usually meant he expected everything to be intuitive. "Good evening, gentlemen, Ms. Sato," Victoria said with a professional smile. "Welcome to Le Bernardin. I'm Victoria, and I'll be taking care of you this evening." The Tanaka executives nodded politely. Alexander barely glanced up from his phone. "We'll start with your finest sake selection," Alexander announced without looking at Victoria. Something that will impress my guests. Price is not an issue. Of course, sir. We have a beautiful Dasai 23 that I think you'll find exceptional. It's... Just bring it, Alexander cut her off, his attention back on his device. And we need to order quickly. This is an important meeting. Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with dismissive clients, but she maintained her composure. She'd served hundreds of men like Alexander Whitmore, powerful, wealthy, and utterly convinced that their money made them better than the people who served them. As she poured water for the Tanaka executives, she couldn't help but notice their uncomfortable glances at Alexander's rudeness. In Japanese business culture, respect for service staff was paramount. Alexander was already making a poor impression without realizing it. The menu this evening features several specialties, Victoria began, launching into her rehearsed presentation. Our chef recommends. Look, Alexander interrupted, finally looking up from his phone with visible irritation. We don't need the whole song and dance. Just bring us your most expensive dishes. These gentlemen need to know they're getting the premium treatment. Ms. Sato shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Actually, we would appreciate hearing about the chef's recommendations, she said in perfect English. We value the expertise of the staff. Victoria smiled gratefully at Ms. Sato. Thank you. I'd be happy to walk you through tonight's selections. For the next 10 minutes, Victoria provided detailed descriptions of each dish, answering thoughtful questions from the Tanaka executives about ingredients and preparation methods. Their respect for her knowledge was obvious, and she found herself relaxing slightly as the conversation flowed. Alexander grew increasingly agitated, checking his watch and phone repeatedly. When Victoria mentioned the restaurant's commitment to sustainable fishing practices, he finally exploded. Can we please just order? This isn't a cooking class. The temperature at the table dropped perceptibly. Mr. Tanaka exchanged a meaningful look with his colleagues. Victoria maintained her professional demeanor. Of course, sir. Are you ready to place your orders? The meal proceeded with careful politeness from the Tanaka executives and growing impatience from Alexander. Every time Victoria approached the table, he found something to criticize. The wine was too warm, the bread took too long, the courses weren't spaced properly for his timeline. The breaking point came during the main course. Victoria approached with a fresh bottle of wine, having noticed Alexander's glass was nearly empty. As she moved to pour, Alexander was gesticulating broadly, explaining his company's technological superiority to the increasingly skeptical Japanese executives. His elbow caught Victoria's wrist just as she began to pour. The wine, a $400 bottle of Bordeaux, splashed across the white tablecloth, sending dark red droplets onto Alexander's pristine shirt cuff. The restaurant seemed to pause. Nearby diners turned to look. The Tanaka executives froze. Alexander shot to his feet, his face flushing red. Are you kidding me? Do you have any idea how much this shirt costs? Victoria immediately began the practiced ritual of damage control. I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore. Let me get this cleaned up right away. I can have the stain treated immediately. Sorry. Alexander's voice rose, cutting through the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. Sorry doesn't fix this. What kind of idiot doesn't watch where she's going? The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Victoria felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but something else flickered in her eyes. A flash of the brilliance that her economics professors at Emory had recognized, the steel that kept her working 3 jobs without breaking. Sir, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. Accidents happen. I take full responsibility, and the restaurant will, of course, take responsibility. Alexander's voice carried across half the restaurant now. You people never take real responsibility. You just make excuses and expect others to clean up your mistakes. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Tanaka slowly placed his napkin on the table and stood up. His colleagues followed suit. Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Tanaka said, his voice calm but final. Tanaka Industries cannot do business with someone who shows such disrespect to hard-working people. Alexander's face went from red to pale in an instant. What? No, you don't understand. We understand perfectly, Miss Sato said, gathering her purse. Your character has been quite clearly displayed tonight. This has nothing to do with business. In Japan, how you treat service staff tells us everything we need to know about your character, Mr. Yamamoto added quietly. The deal is off. Victoria watched in stunned silence as the three executives walked calmly toward the exit, leaving Alexander standing alone at the wine-stained table, the ruins of his $2.6 billion merger scattered around him like broken glass. The entire restaurant was watching now. Cell phones were out, recording. By morning, the video would have millions of views. Alexander turned back to Victoria, his eyes wild with panic and rage. Look what you've done. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? Victoria looked at this powerful man who had just lost everything because he couldn't see her humanity, and for the first time in years, she found her voice. No, sir, she said quietly, with the dignity of someone who had never forgotten her worth, even when the world tried to make her invisible. You did this to yourself. And in that moment, something shifted in the universe. Justice served cold, consequence meeting cruelty, and the first crack appearing in the wall around Alexander Whitmore's heart. The Uber ride back to her studio apartment felt like traveling through a fog of disbelief. Victoria sat in the back seat, staring at her phone as notification after notification lit up the screen. The video was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. #IdiotCEO was trending nationally, and her face was attached to every share, every angry comment, every call for justice. She hadn't asked for this. The driver kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Hey, aren't you that waitress from the video? The one that rich guy called. Can we please just drive in silence? Victoria's voice came out sharper than she intended. Her phone rang. TMZ. She declined the call, but it rang again immediately. CNN. Then Fox News. Then a number she didn't recognize, probably another reporter hungry for her story, her pain, her humiliation served up as content for the 24-hour news cycle. By the time she reached her apartment in Koreatown, her phone had died from the constant buzzing. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her studio, hands shaking as she fumbled with her keys. Inside, she finally allowed herself to collapse onto her second-hand couch. The silence felt deafening after hours of cameras and questions and strangers telling her she was brave for simply existing in the space where someone else chose to reveal their ugliness. Her landline rang, the phone her mother insisted she keep for emergencies. Victoria's heart sank as she realized what this meant. Victoria. Baby, I just saw someone at church showed me on their phone. Are you okay? Her mother's voice carried 3 decades of worry, of watching her brilliant daughter navigate a world determined to diminish her. I'm fine, Mama. You are not fine. That man. What he said to you. Her mother's voice broke slightly. Baby, you know that's not who you are, right? You know your worth isn't determined by some ignorant. I know, Mama. I know. But even as she said it, Victoria felt the familiar ache, the one that lived in the space between knowing her worth intellectually and feeling it in her bones. The whole internet is talking about it. They're saying he lost some big business deal because of what he did. Victoria closed her eyes. Good. She shouldn't feel guilty about his consequences, shouldn't care that his carelessness had cost him everything. But something twisted in her stomach anyway. Not sympathy, but a recognition of how quickly a life could implode. I don't want to talk about him, Mama. Okay, baby. But, Victoria, you come home if you need to. You hear me. You don't have to stay in that city if it gets to be too much. After her mother hung up, Victoria sat in the dark, processing the day's whiplash. This morning she'd been anonymous, invisible, just another service worker in a city full of them. Tonight she was a symbol, a hashtag, a talking point in conversations about race and class and power. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The subject line made her stomach drop. Interview request, the Victoria James story. She slammed the laptop shut. 2 miles away in Beverly Hills, Alexander Whitmore sat in his hotel suite, watching his life disintegrate in real time across multiple news channels. His phone had been ringing non-stop until he finally turned it off entirely. His lawyers, his board of directors, his investors. Everyone wanted answers he didn't have. The Tanaka Industries statement had been swift and brutal. Whitmore Industries' values are incompatible with our corporate culture. We are terminating all negotiations effective immediately. $2.6 billion. Gone because he couldn't control his mouth for 30 seconds. Alexander poured himself another scotch, his fourth since returning to the hotel, and tried to process what had happened. He'd been tired, stressed about the merger details, and when that waitress had hesitated with the wine selection, the word had just slipped out. Except it wasn't really slipping, was it? It was muscle memory, the casual dismissal he'd learned from his father, the unconscious assumption that people in service positions were somehow less. His reflection in the hotel window looked like a stranger, expensive suit wrinkled, silver hair disheveled, eyes red with exhaustion and alcohol. When did he become this person? The business news was calling it the fastest corporate downfall in Silicon Valley history. His stock price had tanked 16% in after-hours trading. The board of directors had already called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Alexander tried to focus on damage control, reputation management, and crisis communications. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the waitress, Victoria, her name badge had read. The way she'd straightened her shoulders when he'd spoken to her, maintained her composure while he'd revealed himself to be exactly the kind of man he'd always claimed he wasn't. He'd given hundreds of speeches about corporate responsibility, diversity, and inclusion. Whitmore Industries' website prominently featured their commitment to equality and respect. And in one moment, he'd exposed it all as performative bullshit. His laptop dinged with an email from his assistant. Mr. Whitmore, I've received 847 interview requests in the past 4 hours. How would you like me to respond? Alexander stared at the message, then typed back, tell them all no comment. But even as he sent it, he knew no comment wouldn't be enough. The internet had already decided who he was. The racist CEO who got what he deserved. And maybe, he thought as he poured another drink, maybe they were right. He tried to remember the last time he genuinely apologized for anything, and couldn't. The scotch burned going down, but not as much as the realization that he'd spent 42 years becoming someone he wouldn't want to know. Outside his hotel window, Los Angeles glittered with possibility and dreams. The same city where a brilliant woman named Victoria James was probably lying awake, wondering why other people's ugliness always seemed to become her burden to carry. Neither of them knew that in 72 hours, they'd be forced into the same room again, their lives intersecting in ways that would demand they both become different people than they'd been at Le Bernardin. The resistance was already cracking, though neither was ready to admit it yet. The Detroit Community Center on 8 Mile Road smelled like industrial disinfectant and forgotten dreams, nothing like the mahogany-scented boardrooms where Alexander Whitmore had once commanded billions. 6 weeks after losing everything, he stood in the volunteer orientation room wearing jeans that still had their tags attached and a humility so new it chafed worse than the unfamiliar denim. Alexander Whitmore? The coordinator, Mrs. Washington, squinted at her clipboard with skeptical eyes. Say you're interested in our job placement program mentoring? Yes, ma'am. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He'd never called anyone ma'am who wasn't signing a multi-million-dollar contract. And you understand this is volunteer work? No compensation except the satisfaction of helping folks get back on their feet. Alexander nodded, though satisfaction felt like a concept from another planet. Nothing had felt satisfying since that night at Le Bernardin when his world imploded in real time. The Tanaka executives had walked out mid-dinner after his comment to the waitress. By morning, the video had gone viral. By noon, his board had voted him out. By evening, he was persona non grata in every business circle from Manhattan to Silicon Valley. Well then, Mrs. Washington continued, let me introduce you to your co-coordinator. She's been running our employment workshop program for 2 years. Victoria. Alexander's blood turned to ice water as Victoria James emerged from behind a partition, her expression shifting from professional welcome to something approaching physical revulsion in the space of a heartbeat. You've got to be kidding me, Victoria said, her voice low and dangerous. Mrs. Washington looked between them with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every possible human configuration of drama. Y'all know each other? We've met, Victoria replied, never taking her eyes off Alexander. Mrs. Washington, I don't think this arrangement will work. Now hold on, the older woman said, raising a weathered hand. This man's been court-ordered to complete 200 hours of community service as part of some legal settlement. You two got history, that's between y'all, but these folks coming to our program need help, and I got 2 coordinators who know their business. Personal feelings don't feed families or find jobs. Alexander found his voice. Victoria, I understand if you're uncomfortable. I can request a different assignment. Don't. The word cracked like a whip. Don't you dare make this about my comfort. You think you get to waltz in here and play the considerate gentleman now? After what you did. What exactly did he do? Mrs. Washington's tone suggested she'd heard every sob story and seen every angle. Victoria's jaw tightened. 6 weeks ago, this man called me an idiot in front of a room full of people because I was serving his table and he didn't like how I arranged his water glasses. The video went viral. Racist CEO destroys waitress dignity was trending for 3 days. Mrs. Washington's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. That was you. Lord have mercy. She studied Alexander with new interest. So you the millionaire who lost all that money for running his mouth? Former millionaire, Alexander said quietly. And yes. Mrs. Washington tapped her pen against the clipboard. Well, seems like life has a sense of humor. Victoria, I understand your feelings, but I got 18 people signed up for next week's workshop and only 1 other volunteer who knows anything about corporate hiring practices. This man may have been an ass, but his resume says he knows how to navigate business systems. Mrs. Washington. And you, she turned to Alexander. might learn something about the folks you used to look down on. Consider it part of your education. Victoria crossed her arms. I'm not babysitting him. Wouldn't ask you to. But you will work together professional-like, because that's what these job seekers deserve. Y'all can settle your personal business on your own time. What do you think? Can someone who's shown prejudice truly change, or are some lines too deep to cross? Share your thoughts on second chances. The first workshop session the following Monday was excruciating. Victoria had prepared a presentation on interview skills while Alexander was supposed to cover resume writing. They moved around each other like opposing magnets, professional but cold. The attendees, unemployed auto workers, single mothers, former inmates, didn't seem to notice the tension. They were too focused on hope, hanging on every word about cover letters and networking strategies. Now, when you walk into that interview, Victoria was saying, remember that you belong there. Don't let anyone make you feel small because of where you come from or what you've been through. Alexander watched her speak and felt something twist in his chest. She commanded the room with natural authority, breaking down complex concepts with patience he'd never possessed. These people trusted her immediately, instinctively recognizing someone who understood struggle. Mr. Alexander, called out Denise, a laid-off Ford worker. You really think somebody like me got a chance at one of those corporate jobs? I ain't been to college. Alexander looked at Denise. 50-something, worn hands, eyes that had seen too much disappointment. And for the first time in his life, he saw a person instead of a demographic. Some of the smartest people I've worked with never set foot in a university, he said slowly. You've got 25 years of manufacturing experience. You know quality control, team leadership, problem-solving under pressure. That's worth more than most MBA programs teach. Denise's face lit up. You really think so? I know so. And Alexander realized he meant it. After the session, as participants filed out clutching their worksheets and newfound confidence, Victoria began stacking chairs with sharp, efficient movements. That was good, she said without looking at him. What you said to Denise. She reminded me of my grandmother, Alexander said, then stopped, surprised by the admission. Victoria paused, chair halfway to the stack. Your grandmother worked in a factory? Glass factory in Pittsburgh. I raised 6 kids after my grandfather died in Korea. He'd never told anyone that story, had spent decades burying his blue-collar roots under layers of Ivy League credentials and designer suits. What happened to her? Died when I was 12, right before my father made his first million. Alexander's voice grew quiet. He said we didn't need to talk about that part of our family anymore. That we were different now. Victoria set the chair down, studying his face. And you believed him? I wanted to. Honesty hurts. It was easier to forget where I came from than to remember who got left behind. They worked in silence for several minutes, the weight of shared revelation settling between them. Finally, Victoria spoke. I don't forgive you, she said. But I'm starting to think maybe you're not the same man who called me an idiot. I'm not sure who that man was, Alexander replied. But I know I don't want to be him anymore. Outside, Detroit's November wind rattled the windows, but inside the community center, something warmer was beginning to grow. The community center's archive room smelled of dust and forgotten dreams as Victoria sorted through boxes of old photographs for the upcoming Black History Month exhibit. She hadn't expected to find Alexander there on a Saturday morning, but there he was, carefully cataloging donated books with the same precision he'd once applied to billion-dollar deals. You're early, she said, not looking up from a box labeled Detroit Families 1950 to 1980. Couldn't sleep. His voice carried a weariness she'd begun to recognize. Figured I might as well make myself useful. They'd been working together for 6 weeks now, an unlikely partnership born of necessity and sustained by something neither wanted to name. The media tension had finally died down, leaving them in this strange space between forgiveness and friendship. Victoria pulled out a photograph and froze. The image showed a grand Victorian house with wraparound porches and manicured gardens. In front stood a distinguished black family, a man in a suit, a woman in pearls, 2 children in Sunday clothes. The back was inscribed, "The Williams Family Estate, Birmingham, Alabama, 1955. Williams, she whispered. That had been her grandmother's maiden name before she married grandfather James. Alexander looked up from his cataloging. Everything okay? Victoria stared at the photograph, her hands trembling slightly. This might be my family. He abandoned his books and moved closer, studying the image over her shoulder. Your family owned that house? My grandmother used to tell stories about the big house in Birmingham. How her father was a successful businessman, owned 3 department stores and a hotel. Victoria's voice grew distant with memory. I always thought she was just romanticizing the past, making it sound better than it was. She continued sifting through the box, finding more photographs of the Williams family. A grand wedding. Children playing in elaborate gardens. A prosperous business district with Williams department store prominently displayed. What happened to it all? Alexander asked quietly. Victoria found her answer in a newspaper clipping from 1956. Negro businesses forced to close. White Citizens Council boycotts target successful black entrepreneurs. The article detailed how organized boycotts and intimidation tactics had systematically destroyed Birmingham's black business district. They took it all away, Victoria said, her voice barely audible. Every store, every property, every dream. My great-grandfather went from owning half of downtown Birmingham to washing dishes in Detroit. Alexander stared at the clippings, his face pale. The same year my grandfather expanded his real estate empire into the South. Victoria looked up sharply. What? My family's fortune. A significant portion came from property acquisitions in the South in the 1950s and 60s. My grandfather always said he got incredible deals on prime real estate. Alexander's voice cracked with realization. Victoria, I think my family might have profited from what happened to yours. The weight of generational impact settled between them like a physical presence. Victoria set down the photographs with careful deliberation, her economist's mind calculating the compound interest of stolen dreams. Do you know what I think about sometimes? She said, her voice steady but charged with emotion. I think about how different my life might have been if they hadn't stolen my great-grandfather's businesses. If my grandmother had inherited department stores instead of trauma. If my mother had grown up in that big house instead of Detroit housing projects. Alexander sat heavily in a nearby chair, the implications crushing him. Victoria, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. But there was no malice in her voice, only exhaustion. You grew up in the house that history built for you. I grew up in the shadow of the house they burned down for mine. She pulled out more photographs, laying them on the table like evidence in a trial that would never come. The Williams family's prosperity was documented in black and white. Children in private school uniforms, family vacations to Martha's Vineyard, a college graduation from Howard University in 1954. My great-grandfather had a master's degree in business from Tuskegee, Victoria continued. In 1932. He was buying real estate when most white men wouldn't even consider it. He was brilliant, Alexander. Just like his great-granddaughter who's serving tables because she can't afford to pursue her economics doctorate. Alexander stared at the photographs, seeing them with new eyes. The restaurant that night, when I called you an idiot. Victoria finished the sentence without flinching. You saw a black waitress and assumed she was less intelligent, less capable, less worthy of basic respect. Just like they saw a successful black businessman in 1956 and decided he didn't deserve what he'd built. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of inherited sins and stolen futures. I've been thinking about that night, Alexander said finally. About why I said what I said. I told myself it was just stress, just the pressure of the deal. But that's not true, is it? Victoria studied his face, seeing genuine anguish there. What do you think it was? I was raised to see people like you as less than. Not consciously, not explicitly. But it was there in every conversation, every assumption, every door that opened for me because I was white and male and wealthy. He picked up one of the photographs. A young black boy in a school uniform, smiling at the camera. I was taught that my success was inevitable, earned, deserved. Never that it might have been built on someone else's stolen dreams. What do you think about generational wealth and how past injustices affect present opportunities? Share your thoughts on how history shapes our current realities. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. The boy who said those words to me that night wasn't born evil, was he? He was taught to see the world in a way that made cruelty seem normal. Does that excuse it? No. Her answer was immediate and firm. But it explains it. And maybe understanding how someone became broken is the first step toward helping them heal. Alexander looked at her with something approaching wonder. How can you even consider forgiving me after seeing this? He gestured to the photographs. After knowing what my family's success might have cost yours? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying the image of her great-grandfather in his tailored suit, standing proudly in front of his department store. Because he wouldn't want his great-granddaughter to carry hatred in her heart, she said finally. Because choosing bitterness would let them win twice, first by stealing his dreams, then by poisoning mine. She looked directly at Alexander, her dark eyes clear and determined. But if you want my forgiveness, you'll have to earn it. Not with words or apologies, but with action. Show me you understand what privilege really costs. Show me you're willing to use yours to build up instead of tear down. Alexander nodded, understanding that this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to prove that people could change, that the sins of the fathers didn't have to define the sons. What do you need me to do? Victoria smiled for the first time that morning, and Alexander felt something in his chest that he'd never experienced before. The possibility of redemption earned through love. 3 weeks into their unlikely partnership at the Detroit Community Center, Victoria found herself looking forward to Tuesday afternoons in ways that both surprised and unsettled her. She arrived early that day, as had become her habit, finding Alexander already in the kitchen preparing lunch for the homeless shelter program. The transformation in him was undeniable. Gone were the designer suits and arrogant posture. He wore simple jeans and a volunteer t-shirt, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he chopped vegetables for the soup kitchen. His hair had grown out from its severe corporate cut, and the stress lines around his eyes had softened into something that looked almost like peace. "You're early again," Victoria observed, tying her apron around her waist. "So are you," Alexander replied, glancing up with a smile that had taken weeks to earn. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Patterson said yesterday." Mrs. Patterson was an 80-year-old regular at the center who had lived through the civil rights movement in Detroit. She had a way of dispensing wisdom that cut straight to the bone, and yesterday she had looked directly at Alexander while telling stories about white allies who had shown up not with grand gestures, but with consistent, quiet service. "She has a way of making you think, doesn't she?" Victoria said, beginning to organize the serving station. "She reminded me of something I'd forgotten," Alexander said quietly. "My grandmother used to volunteer at a soup kitchen in Chicago when I was little, before my parents decided that kind of work was beneath our station. I remember feeling proud of her then, proud of the way people's faces would light up when they saw her coming." Victoria paused in her preparations, struck by the vulnerability in his voice. These glimpses into his humanity had been emerging more frequently, small cracks in the wall he'd built around himself with money and power. "What happened to that little boy?" she asked softly. Alexander's hands stilled on the cutting board. He learned that the world rewards different things than kindness. He learned that being soft makes you weak, that caring about people who can't help your career is a luxury you can't afford. He looked up at her, his eyes holding a pain she recognized. He learned to see people as transactions instead of people. The honesty hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. "I understand that lesson," Victoria said finally. "I learned early that being angry about injustice is seen as aggressive, that demanding respect is called uppity, that excellence has to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy." She met his gaze. "We both learned to survive by becoming smaller versions of ourselves. What do you think happens when two wounded people start to see past each other's survival masks? Share your thoughts on authentic connection in the comments." Alexander set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Victoria, I need you to know something. That night at the restaurant, what I said to you, it wasn't just about being stressed or overwhelmed. It came from an ugliness in me that I'd been carrying for so long I didn't even see it anymore." "Alexander, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm but gentle. "You deserve to know that I see it now. I see how many assumptions I made, how many ways I'd learned to dismiss people who looked like you, who worked jobs like yours. I see how wrong I was, and I'm sorry. Truly sorry." Victoria studied his face, searching for any trace of performance or manipulation. She found only sincerity and something that looked like genuine remorse. "Apologies are easy," she said carefully. "Change is harder." "Then judge me by my actions," Alexander said. "I know words are cheap coming from someone like me." They worked in companionable silence for a while, falling into the rhythm they'd developed over the past weeks. Alexander had proven to be surprisingly capable in the kitchen, his corporate efficiency translating well to meal preparation and service. More importantly, he listened, really listened, when the shelter guests shared their stories. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander said as they began setting up the serving line. "What made you start volunteering here?" Victoria considered the question while arranging napkins and utensils. "My grandmother," she said finally. "She used to say that we're all just walking each other home, you know? That person sleeping on the street corner, that single mother trying to feed her kids, that veteran struggling with PTSD, they're all just trying to find their way home to themselves." "Walking each other home," Alexander repeated softly. I like that. Grandmama said the only difference between blessing and burden is perspective. Every person you meet is carrying something heavy. You can choose to make that load lighter or heavier. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. I spent 15 years making people's loads heavier, he said finally. Employees I fired to boost quarterly numbers, communities I displaced for development projects, competitors I crushed because I could. But you're here now, Victoria pointed out, making loads lighter. Because of you. The words slipped out before Alexander could stop them, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Victoria felt her breath catch, her heart doing something complicated against her ribs. Alexander. She began, but he held up a hand. I know how that sounds. I know what people would think, the disgraced CEO and the waitress he wronged. I know it looks like a redemption story that's too convenient to be real. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But Victoria, what I feel for you, it's not about redemption. It's about recognition. You're the first person in years who's seen me, really seen me, not my bank account or my connections or what I could do for them, but the man underneath all of that. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. That goes both ways, she whispered. You see me too. Not the server or the scholarship girl or the charity case, but me. They stood there in the community center kitchen, surrounded by the simple tools of service, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them. The impossible distance between their worlds seemed to collapse into something as simple as two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their assumptions. What are we doing, Alexander? Victoria asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know, he admitted. But for the first time in my life, I don't need to know. I just need to be here with you walking each other home. Victoria smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile she'd given him since that night in Beverly Hills. Grandmama would have liked you. Yeah. She always said the best people are the ones who've been broken and chose to put themselves back together with gold in the cracks. Makes them stronger and more beautiful than they were before. Alexander reached out tentatively and took her hand, their fingers intertwining like a promise neither was quite ready to speak aloud. The shelter guests would start arriving soon, and they would serve lunch with the same quiet efficiency they'd developed. But something had shifted between them, something fragile and precious and terrifying in its possibility. They were walking each other home, and neither of them had ever felt less lost. The TMZ headline blazed across Victoria's phone screen at 6:47 a.m. Disgraced CEO's charity scam? Whitmore spotted cozying up to a waitress he insulted. Below it, a grainy photo of her and Alexander working side by side at the Detroit Community Center, his hand gently touching her shoulder as they sorted donations. Victoria's stomach dropped as she scrolled through the article. Anonymous sources claimed Alexander was using his community service as a rehabilitation publicity stunt, and that his relationship with Victoria was strategic manipulation designed to rebuild his image on the backs of the black community he insulted. Her phone exploded with notifications. Text after text from friends, family, co-workers. Her mother's voice trembled through a voicemail. Baby, people are saying terrible things. Are you safe? Is this man using you? The worst came from her sister Jasmine in Atlanta. V, please tell me you're not sleeping with that racist for money. Our family has more dignity than that. Victoria's hands shook as she set the phone down. She had known this moment would come, the moment when their private connection became a public spectacle, when the world would reduce their complicated relationship to ugly stereotypes and malicious assumptions. Her apartment door buzzed. Through the security monitor, she saw Alexander standing in the hallway, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like panic. "Victoria, please," his voice cracked through the intercom. "I need to explain." She buzzed him up, steeling herself for whatever fresh disaster he'd brought to her doorstep. Alexander entered looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual polished appearance was gone, wrinkled shirt, 5 o'clock shadow, eyes red-rimmed with stress. "You saw the articles," he said. "Hard to miss. My phone's been ringing since dawn." Victoria crossed her arms, studying his face. "Funny thing, though. The story quotes sources close to Whitmore Industries saying you planned this whole thing. Sources who seem to know an awful lot about your private motivations." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Those sources are my former board members. They're trying to destroy any chance I have of rebuilding my reputation. Or maybe they're just telling the truth." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Victoria, you can't believe that. After everything we've shared, everything I've told you." "What am I supposed to believe, Alexander?" Her voice rose, months of suppressed anger finally breaking through. "A month ago, you called me an idiot in front of a room full of people. Now suddenly you're volunteering at community centers and spouting social justice talking points. How does that look to anyone with half a brain?" "It looks like someone who realized he was wrong and tried to change. Or it looks like someone who got caught being exactly who he always was and is now trying to buy his way back to respectability." Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "Do you have any idea what it's like for me right now? My own family thinks I'm betraying everything we stand for. My coworkers think I'm sleeping my way to some kind of payoff. The community I've served for years thinks I've sold out." Alexander stepped toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "And the worst part," she continued, tears threatening, "is that I can't even defend you properly, because I don't know if they're right. I don't know if the man I've been falling for is real, or just another performance from someone who's used to buying whatever he wants." "Victoria, please. Did you leak our relationship to the press?" The question came out flat, direct. Alexander's hesitation was a fraction of a second too long. "No, I would never. But someone did. Someone with access to information about where we've been, what we've been doing." Victoria's voice grew colder. "Someone who knew exactly how to position this story to make me look like a gold digger and you look like a manipulative opportunist. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this." Victoria studied his face, searching for truth in features that had become so familiar. But doubt had taken root, poisoned by months of watching powerful men manipulate situations to their advantage. Her phone rang. Her mother's ringtone. "I have to take this," she answered, putting it on speaker. "Hi, Mama." "Victoria, baby." Her mother's voice was thick with worry and disappointment. "I just got off the phone with Pastor Williams. The whole church is talking about these articles. People are saying you've forgotten where you came from, that you're letting this white man use you for his own purposes." Victoria closed her eyes. "Mama, it's not like that." "Then what is it like? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're dating the man who called you an idiot on national television. The same man whose family probably owned our ancestors." Alexander flinched as if he'd been slapped. "I raised you better than this, Victoria. I taught you that our dignity isn't for sale, no matter how much money someone waves in front of us." "I know, Mama. I know." Victoria's voice broke. "Come home, baby. Come back to Atlanta where people know your worth. This man and his world will never see you as anything more than an experiment. The call ended in silence that felt like death. Alexander reached for her, but Victoria stepped away. "She's right, isn't she?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. This was always going to end this way. The powerful white man gets his redemption story, and the black woman who enabled it gets crucified in the process. That's not what this is. You know that's not what this is. Do I? Victoria turned to face him fully, and Alexander saw something breaking in her eyes. Because right now I feel like the biggest fool in America. I believed in you. I believed you'd actually changed. But maybe my mother's right. Maybe people like you don't really change. Maybe you just get better at hiding who you've always been. What would you do if the person you were falling for became the center of a media storm that threatened everything you'd worked for? Tell us in the comments. Is love worth risking your reputation? Alexander's face went pale. Victoria, I love you. I know that sounds impossible. I know the timing is terrible, but I love you. Not as some publicity stunt or rehabilitation project. I love who you are, how you've made me want to be better. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. You love me. You love the idea of me, Alexander. You love how good I make you feel about yourself, how I help you sleep at night after years of being a terrible person. But you don't love me enough to protect me from this. She moved toward the door, her movements sharp with finality. I think you should leave. Victoria, please don't do this. Don't let them win. Don't let them destroy what we've built. She turned back to him, tears finally spilling over. What did we build? Alexander, what we built was a fantasy. And fantasies don't survive contact with the real world. Alexander stood in her doorway, watching the woman he loved slip away from him. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Victoria's voice was steady now, resigned. Go back to your world, Alexander. Find some nice white woman who doesn't come with all this baggage. Someone whose community won't question your motives, whose family won't think you're slumming it for the cameras. I don't want anyone else. I want you. Victoria met his eyes one last time. Then you should have thought of that before you built a life where wanting me would cost us both everything. The door closed between them with a finality that echoed through both their hearts. Outside her building, Alexander sat in his car for 20 minutes, staring at her darkened window. His phone buzzed with calls from reporters, former colleagues, and crisis management firms offering to handle the situation. He ignored them all, finally understanding that the real crisis wasn't his ruined reputation or lost fortune. It was the woman upstairs who had just walked out of his life, taking with her the only thing that had ever made him feel truly wealthy. Inside her apartment, Victoria slumped against the door, finally letting the tears come. For the first time in months, she felt completely, utterly alone. The rain had been falling on Detroit for 3 days straight, matching the gray emptiness that had settled over both their lives since the media explosion tore them apart. Victoria sat in her small apartment, staring at the economics paper she'd been trying to write for weeks. The same research on systemic inequality that had sparked their first real conversation at the community center. The cursor blinked mockingly on the blank page. How could she write about breaking down barriers when she'd let fear build walls around her own heart? Her phone sat silent on the desk, though she'd checked it obsessively for 5 days. No calls. No texts. No word from Alexander since that devastating confrontation outside the community center when the cameras caught them together and the world exploded with accusations. He's using you, Victoria, her sister Carmen had shouted over FaceTime from Atlanta. Rich white men don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are. This is exactly what his PR team would orchestrate, her best friend Keisha had added during their painful conversation yesterday. The racist CEO finds redemption through the black woman he insulted? It's too perfect. Too convenient. Victoria had defended him then, but doubt had crept in like poison. Was Alexander's transformation real, or was she just another business strategy? Had she been naive to believe someone could change so fundamentally? The knock at her door made her jump. Through the peephole she saw Mrs. Henderson from down the hall, holding an envelope. "This came for you, honey. Messenger delivered it about an hour ago." Victoria's hands trembled as she recognized Alexander's precise handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and what looked like legal documents. "Victoria, I know you have no reason to trust my words anymore. The media circus made sure of that. So I'm not going to try to convince you with explanations or apologies you've already heard. Instead, I'm showing you. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., I'm testifying before the Detroit City Council in support of the fair housing initiative you championed at the community center. I've also personally funded the legal challenge against discriminatory lending practices in 3 Detroit neighborhoods. The attached documents transfer my remaining assets into a foundation dedicated to economic justice initiatives. You'll see your mother's medical bills have been paid in full, along with tuition for your doctoral program at University of Michigan, if you choose to accept it. This isn't charity, and it's not manipulation. It's justice. You shouldn't have to choose between caring for your family and pursuing your dreams. I don't expect these actions to earn your forgiveness or love. I'm doing this because it's right, because you showed me what right looks like. Whether you're in my life or not, I will spend the rest of it trying to be worthy of the lesson you taught me. If you can find it in your heart to believe that people can truly change, I'll be at Belle Isle Park at sunset tonight, sitting by the Detroit River where we had our first real conversation. If not, I understand. Either way, you've already given me the greatest gift possible. You showed me who I really wanted to be. Alexander." Victoria's hands shook as she read the legal documents. He had liquidated nearly everything. His penthouse, his art collection, his stock portfolio. The foundation was real, with her listed as an advisory board member if she chose to accept. Her phone rang. Carmen's name flashed on the screen. "Victoria, I just saw the news. That man, Alexander, he's all over CNN testifying about housing discrimination. He's going after his own former business partners, exposing deals he says were rooted in systemic racism." Victoria turned on her television. There was Alexander on the council floor, his voice steady and clear as he detailed how his former company had contributed to discriminatory practices. He looked different, thinner, more human somehow. The corporate armor was gone. "I stand before you not seeking absolution, but accepting accountability," he was saying to the packed council chamber. "I spent 42 years benefiting from systems designed to exclude people like Victoria James, brilliant, dedicated citizens whose potential our society systematically undervalues. That ends with me today." The camera panned to show protesters outside, some supporting him, others calling him a fraud. Either way, he was sacrificing what remained of his reputation. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Baby, I don't know what you said to that man, but he paid off my medical debt and sent a check for your education. Whatever happened between you two, he's trying to make things right. What do you believe? Can people truly change, or should Victoria trust her community's skepticism? Share your thoughts about second chances and authentic transformation." As evening approached, Victoria found herself standing at her closet, staring at her reflection. She had two choices: stay safe in her anger and assumptions, or risk her heart on the possibility that love could bridge any divide. She thought about the man she'd seen on television today. Vulnerable, committed, using his privilege to dismantle the systems that had created it. That wasn't the arrogant CEO who'd called her an idiot 6 months ago. That was someone who'd done the hardest work possible, looking honestly at himself and choosing to change. Victoria grabbed her jacket and headed for Belle Isle Park. The sunset painted the Detroit River in shades of gold and crimson as she approached the bench where they'd first talked about dreams deferred and second chances. Alexander sat alone, looking out over the water, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man who'd lost everything and was learning what actually mattered. He turned when he heard her footsteps on the path, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "You came," he said simply. Victoria sat down beside him, close enough to touch but still maintaining careful distance. "I watched your testimony today. I meant every word." "I know." She turned to face him fully. "Alexander, what you did to me that night, it wasn't just about one word. It was about centuries of that word. Generations of my family being dismissed and diminished. You can't undo that." His face fell, but he nodded. "You're right. I can't. But," Victoria continued, her voice softer, "what you've done since the foundation, the testimony, the way you've used your losses to create change for others, that's not performance. That's a transformation." Alexander's eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "Victoria, I love you. Not because you saved me, not because you taught me to be better, but because of who you are, your strength, your dignity, your brilliant mind, your incredible heart. I love you for reasons that have nothing to do with my redemption." Victoria felt her own walls finally crumbling. "I love you too. Against all logic, against all advice, against all my own defenses. I love you." They sat in the gathering dusk, two people who had found each other across the deepest divides, proving that love could indeed conquer anything when it was built on genuine respect, authentic change, and the courage to be vulnerable. "So what happens now?" Alexander asked. Victoria smiled, taking his hand as the first stars appeared over the Detroit River. "Now we build something beautiful together." 6 months later, Victoria stood in the bustling community center in Detroit's Corktown district, watching Alexander address a packed room of local business leaders, activists, and city officials. The man speaking passionately about economic justice and systemic reform bore little resemblance to the arrogant CEO who had called her an idiot in that Beverly Hills restaurant. The Whitmore Foundation is committing $50 million over the next 5 years to support minority-owned businesses and educational initiatives, Alexander announced, his voice carrying the same authority that once commanded boardrooms, now channeled toward justice. "But more importantly, we're establishing mentorship programs that pair established business leaders with emerging entrepreneurs from underserved communities." The applause was thunderous, but Victoria barely heard it. She was remembering the Alexander who had shown up at this same community center 8 months ago. Broken, humbled, desperate to prove his transformation was real. The man who had spent sleepless nights learning about systemic racism, who had liquidated personal assets to fund the foundation before his reputation could recover enough to attract other donors. After the presentation, Alexander found her in the hallway outside the main room, his eyes searching her face with the vulnerability she'd come to love. "So," he asked quietly, "what did you think?" "I think," Victoria said, stepping closer, "that you just announced the largest private commitment to economic justice this city has seen in decades." She paused, letting her hand brush his. "I think Aunt Millicent would be proud." Alexander's face softened at the mention of Victoria's aunt, whose community center had become the launching pad for his genuine transformation. The elderly woman who had first challenged him to move beyond apologies into action. Victoria. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There's something else I want to announce. Something I wanted to ask you first. Before she could respond, he was down on one knee in the hallway of the Detroit Community Center where they'd found their way back to each other. The ring in his hands wasn't the ostentatious diamond his old self might have chosen. It was a simple, elegant band with her grandmother's stone, the one she'd mentioned selling years ago to help with her mother's medical bills. He'd tracked it down through 3 pawn shops and bought it back. "Victoria James," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You saved my life the moment you looked me in the eyes and refused to let my cruelty diminish your dignity. You saw something worth redemption in a man who didn't deserve it. Will you marry me?" The hallway fell silent except for the sound of her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the windows, she could see the Detroit skyline, a city that knew something about transformation, about rising from ashes stronger than before. "Alexander Whitmore," she said, kneeling down to meet him at eye level. "You lost everything the night you called me an idiot. Your company, your reputation, your old life. But you found something better, you found your soul. And somehow you found me." She cupped his face in her hands, seeing the tears he wasn't trying to hide. "Yes. Yes to building something beautiful together. Yes to the man you've become. Yes to all of it." The kiss that followed was witnessed by Aunt Millicent, who had been watching from the doorway with tears streaming down her cheeks. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered, community center volunteers, local activists, and the children from the after-school program Victoria tutored. They erupted in cheers that echoed through the building. As they stood, Alexander pulled Victoria close, whispering against her ear, "I have one more surprise." He led her outside to where a small crowd had gathered around a bronze plaque being installed beside the community center's entrance. Victoria read the inscription through tears. "The Victoria James Center for Economic Justice true worth cannot be measured by wealth, but by the courage to see dignity in every person. Dedicated to the woman who taught us that losing everything can be the beginning of finding what matters most." "Alexander," she breathed, "you can't name a community center after me." "I didn't," he said, grinning. "The community voted. Unanimously." He gestured to the crowd gathering around them. "Turns out, you've been quietly changing lives here for years. Your economics research, your tutoring, your advocacy work, they all knew your name long before I ever learned what it meant to truly see you." Victoria looked around at faces she'd known for years. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son she'd helped get into college. James, the teenager she'd mentored through his first job interview. Dozens of others whose lives she'd touched through simple acts of care and advocacy. What do you think creates lasting change? Grand gestures or daily acts of kindness? Share your thoughts on making a difference in your community. Her mother appeared through the crowd, having driven up from Atlanta for the surprise. "Baby girl," she said, pulling Victoria into a fierce hug. "I always knew you were going to change the world. I just didn't know you were going to change hearts too." Alexander approached Victoria's mother with the respect he'd learned to show the people who mattered most to the woman he loved. "Mrs. James, I want you to know that Victoria saved my life. I hope I can spend the rest of mine proving worthy of the gift she's given me." Victoria's mother studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Love isn't about being worthy, son. It's about becoming worthy every single day." She smiled. "Welcome to the family." As the sun set over Detroit, casting golden light across the community center plaza, Victoria leaned into Alexander's embrace, watching children play in the courtyard where they'd first begun to trust each other again. "You know what's funny," she said, looking up at him. "That night at Le Bernardin, when you called me an idiot, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. And now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to both of us." She smiled, touching the ring on her finger. "You had to lose everything to find what you were really looking for. And I had to see you at your worst to recognize you at your best." Alexander spun her around, laughing with the kind of joy he'd never known existed. "Victoria James, you are the smartest person I've ever met. And I'm the luckiest man alive that you're willing to spend your life teaching me how to be better." As they kissed under the Detroit streetlights, surrounded by the community they'd served together, Victoria realized that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the worst moments. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you never knew you needed. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed devastating but led to something beautiful? Tell us about a time when your worst day became the beginning of your best chapter in the comments below. The bronze plaque gleamed in the evening light, and Victoria knew that Aunt Millicent had been right all along. True worth isn't measured in dollars or status, but in the courage to see dignity in every person, and sometimes in giving people the chance to find dignity in themselves. This story proves that our lowest moments can become our greatest turning points. What do you believe? Can people truly change, or do we just become more of who we already were? Share your thoughts on redemption and second chances in the comments below. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.